I have a monitor that I'm having some issues with. Sometimes it won't turn on. Sometimes it'll turn on, but after it goes in the sleep mode, it won't come out of it. So I'm going to take it apart and check the capacitors. Usually that's the problem with these monitors. I'm going to start by removing the stand from the back of the monitor. On this particular model, just push this button in and then lift up and slide out. This is a model E2210Hc. I'm going to remove this bezel that goes around the front of the monitor. There's some buttons on the side here. They may be on the side, on the bottom. You want to stay away from those, so I'm going to start in the opposite corner. And these are just snapped on, so you have to pry them off. The seam is right here in this groove, not this line back here, but in this groove. You can use a small screwdriver or some other thin, slightly sharp object to get into this groove, and then just work your way around and pry it apart. Be careful when you get near the buttons because there are some delicate wires in there. So when you get this part loose, just leave the bezel on. Do not completely remove it. Once you have the bezel completely loose all around, then lay the monitor face down on your table. Now I'm going to remove the 4 phillips screws in the back of the monitor. Now you should be able to remove the back of the monitor. I'm going to remove this cover. It's held in place by 3 pieces of tape, and there's a couple more screws on the side. So I'm just going to carefully peel this tape back and try not to tear it. Now I'm going to remove the 2 screws from this end. This cable is also taped down to the back, so I'm going to carefully pry that up. And also over here there's more tape. To disconnect this cable, there's a little tab here. Just push in on that and lift it up, and do that on both sides. And once this is lifted up, you should be able to pull the cable straight out. Here's this ribbon cable and the connector when it's out of the monitor, so you can get a better look at how this comes out. These little tabs have to be pushed in and then lifted up. And then this whole white bracket comes straight up, and then the ribbon cable can be pulled out. And then you can just flip this cable out of the way over to the side. There are two more wires plugged in to this side, and I'm going to have to remove this tape to get at those. And you just have to pull it back far enough so you can see these holes here to push the wires through. Just push down on this end and this hook comes up, and then you can just disconnect this plug and do the same on the other side. This is a close-up of the connector for the backlight, and if you press on this tab in the back, you see how the clip is raised up, and then you can just pull it straight out. You may have to wiggle it back and forth a little bit. And then you want to be careful when you lift the cover off, because there is another flat cable connected here, so just flip the back cover over like that. So now with this cover flipped over, I'm going to remove this power board. There's 5 screws here. And then there are 2 more screws where the cord plugs in. Now you can remove the power board by carefully lifting up this end and then sliding out until the plug clears the frame. Next I'm going to remove this main board, and it's held in with 1 screw here, and then you'll have to remove these connectors. And now this board can be removed. And I'm going to remove this ribbon cable from the main board. It'll just make it a little easier to look them over. To remove this cable, just push down on this tab on this latch and then carefully wheel it back and forth until it comes out. And now I'm going to unplug the main board from the power board, again just to make it a little easier to look it over. And to do that, on this plug, just pinch this together on this latch and then pull it out. Before working on any capacitors, make sure they have been discharged. You can do this with an analog multimeter or by using a resistor. Now I'm going to look at the capacitors on the power board. Sometimes it's easy to tell if they're damaged because they'll be bulged on top sometimes maybe even split open. But just looking these over, I don't see that to be the case with these. Next, I'm going to check the resistance of each capacitor. You cannot use an ohm meter to check it in circuit because it puts out too high of a voltage. Instead, you'll want to use an ESR meter such as this one. An ESR meter puts out a very tiny voltage, and so you can check the capacitors in circuit. So flip the board over and find where the leads come through on the back side. The leads for that capacitor are right here and here. To use this ESR meter, I'm going to turn it on, and then I'm going to touch the leads together and zero it out. And this will compensate for any resistance in the leads. So now I've clipped the alligator clips onto the leads on the back of the board on the capacitor. And you can see I'm getting a reading of 0.02. And on this capacitor you can see it's 470 microfarads, 25 volts. So I look in this chart at 470 microfarads and go across to 25 volts, and we see it should be 0.29 ohms. So we're well within that range. Here's a larger capacitor, 680 microfarads, 25 volts. I'll check that one next. And with the alligator clips connected, I'm getting a reading of 0.04. So looking at the 25 volt column, the 680 falls somewhere in between here, and you can see well within that range. So that one's good also. I've tested the rest of the capacitors on the power board, and they all appear to be good. So now I'm going to check the capacitors on the main board or logic board. So on this board I'll start by testing this capacitor. And that capacitor is right here. So getting a 0.3637 on that one. And that is a 25 volt, 100 microfarad capacitor, so it should be a maximum 0.5. So it's at the upper limit, but should still be okay. I'll test this other one. It's the same size. See, that one's measuring 3.9, and that's well above the 0.5 maximum. So I'm going to replace that one. And there's one more that size over here, so I'll check that one. And that's measuring 2.0, so that one is also above max, so I'm going to replace that one too. And now I'll check the last one, this smaller one in between here. So that one measures about 2.3 ohms, maybe 2.4. And on this chart, there's not that's a 50 volt, 10 microfarad, which would fall somewhere in between here. But you can see that should be a maximum of 2 either way, so it's above that. So I'll replace that one also. So I think since these three were all out of spec and this one was near the top, I'm just going to go ahead and replace them all. So I've got the first capacitor removed. I'll remove the other 3 yet, and then put the new ones in. I have a new 50 volt 10 microfarad capacitor to replace the small one. For the larger capacitors, I have some 35 volt 100 microfarad. The one that was in there was 25 volt, but going up a small amount will be okay, just as long as you don't go less on the voltage or the microfarads. When replacing the capacitors, the polarity is important, and you can see on the board it's marked with a plus sign for the positive side, and on the capacitors there's the longer leg or the anode that is positive, and the shorter leg on these has a negative sign on the canister. And the back of the board is also marked with a plus or positive sign. So now the new capacitors are all soldered in place, and so I can reassemble it and try it out. To reassemble the monitor, I'm going to put the power board back in place. And then replace the 5 screws. Next, I'm going to plug the cable from the power board into the logic board. And that just presses in, and you should hear a click when it snaps into place. Next, I'm going to plug this ribbon cable into the logic board. Just plugs back in here. Make sure this clip snaps into this slot on this plug right here. And then just flip the board over and put it in place and replace this screw. And then I'll replace the 4 screws here. And then replace the 2 screws on the connector on the power board. Now I'm going to flip this over and place it on the back of the monitor. You have to feed these 2 wires up to these slots. Make sure they're free and they don't get pinched under the frame. Also make sure the ribbon cable is not pinched by this frame. Next, replace the 2 screws on the end of the monitor. You might have to pry the monitor slightly up from the bezel to get to the screw holes. And now you can plug these 2 wires back in. And they should just clip in place. You can hear them snap. And then replace this tape that covers them. Now I'm going to replace the tape around the perimeter of this housing. Next, I'm going to replace this ribbon cable. You want to make sure that this little white clip is pulled all the way up. And then when you plug in the ribbon cable, this blue part will be facing towards the white clip. Just slip it in, make sure it's fully seated, and then press down on the tabs on the clip to lock it in place. And then press the tape on the ribbon cable back into this groove to hold it in place. Now I'm going to place the back of the monitor back on. And that should just snap into place. You just want to check your seam and make sure that it's snapped tight all around. Replace the 4 screws in the back of the monitor. To replace the stand, just slip these 2 tabs into these 2 slots and then just push down and it should snap right into place. The monitor appears to be working fine again, so Now I have a good monitor I can use.